So I think especially it's more difficult these days in smaller high school situations where there are more offerings to be able to have that sometimes critical mass of students in your program. And that's nothing to say that's not a commentary upon, well, this person doesn't relate well to students, or there's just a lot of opportunities for them now. So it's a different time.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Everything Band, a podcast that features conversations with composers, conductors, and performers of music for winds and percussion. My name is Mark Connor. I'm a composer, and this is episode 27. My guest for this episode is conductor Jerry Junkin. Before we begin, I'd like to thank all of you for listening and for your support. If you find value from the show and haven't already done so, please leave me a rating on iTunes. You can also follow the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you're really loving what you hear, you can even support me on Patreon at patreon.com/Mark J. Connor. Now, onto the episode. Hi, Jerry.
Hello, how are you, Mark?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for joining me.
Happy to. Pleasure.
So, Jerry, it's an honor for me to talk to you. You're at the pinnacle of the band world. And so this is really great for you to come on the show and to share your wisdom with my guests. And so I guess I want to begin with the beginning. So how did you get your start in music?
Well, that goes back to the beginning, all right, because my father was a high school band director in Victoria, Texas, where I was born and grew up, and he was a very fine musician. There was always music in our house. And so I was going to band conventions and band concerts, when I was in the womb. And I always thought it was the most exciting thing possible to go to a band concert and the hang afterwards, with all of the other teachers and conductors. Even for a little kid, I always was fascinated in that. So I just always loved it. And I never seriously actually considered doing anything else. This is what I always wanted to do.
Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting point you bring up. I have children as well, and my parents were not musicians. And so what was that like to grow up with your father as a band director? What instrument did you start with? How did that sort of influence your early years?
Well, I started, as so many people do, on piano at age 5 or 6, something like that. Mm-hmm. We had a piano because my aunt and uncle had moved to Switzerland for a while he was working on his doctorate at the University of Basel. And so we were the caretakers of their piano for a number of years while they were away. So that gave us an instrument in the house, and I wanted to play and took lessons. And anyway, that really got me into music. But as far as playing wind instruments, I began with the clarinet when I was like in the 5th grade. And ever since then, it's a matter of focusing, first of all, on piano and clarinet, but then letting that expand out too, as you do. And, my desire early on was to be a great high school band director. And so from a pedagogical standpoint, you learn about other instruments, of course. But clarinet and piano was where it all started.
Mm-hmm. I see. I just realized that I kind of feel like you don't need any introduction, but you do. So can you tell the audience who you are?
Yeah. My name is Jerry Junkin. I am the director of bands. I'm in my 30th year as the director of bands and conductor of the wind ensemble at the University of Texas at Austin. And I am in my 25th year as the artistic director and conductor of the Dallas Wind Symphony. And this will be year number 16 now with as the music director of the Hong Kong Wind Philharmonia. And for the last, I think, 7 years, I've been the principal guest conductor of the Shinjuku Gakuen Wind Symphony at the Shinjuku Gakuen College of Music in Kawasaki, Japan.
So 4 ensembles.
Yes. And then, there's always the opportunity to do a little bit more guest conducting. So it's great. I wouldn't have it any other way.
Sure. Keeps you busy, though, I bet.
Yeah, but it's a good busy, as they say.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I just want to kind of circle back to your background again. So was your father your high school band director?
Yes. But both myself and my wife played in his high school band.
Oh, wow.
At Victoria High School. She was a year behind me in school, but we had known each other actually since from an early age, though we didn't get together and start dating till after both of us had gone our separate ways in college. But we did sit in the high school band next to each other in the clarinet section. And it was a remarkable high school band, in a town that had two high schools. And this school, and I just, you don't have any perspective when you're growing up. So I thought everyone's high school band played the Schoenberg Theme and Variations, Opus 43A, and the Hindemith Symphony and pieces like that. I grew up actually playing those in my high school band, thinking nothing of it in a way. So that definitely flavors or colors your view of repertoire, I'll have to say.
Yeah, I think so. Did your wife end up in music?
No, she was a speech pathologist, audiologist, got her degree in speech pathology, audiology, although she, has always enjoyed music and continues till this day to do so. Our daughter played the clarinet in high school band, and she's gone into other things now, but, it's we sort of were a long string of clarinetists. That was my father's instrument also.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So what did your father do that made that band so great? Can you put your finger on it after thinking back?
Yes. And again, you don't necessarily have a real appreciation for this, but he himself was a very fine musician, and he continued to perform. So as a clarinetist, as a saxophonist in a jazz setting, and also later in his life wanted to go back to his piano roots and ended up buying a piano and practicing a lot and playing a lot of piano. So he loved music. And when he quit teaching, he actually retired in a way by today's standards a little early, but he said, he just wanted to retire at a time when he still loved it and didn't want to ever get to the point where he felt like it was a grind. So clearly it wasn't an overt example, but there was this subliminal message, I'm sure, that was planted somehow that says, that this is a wonderful life. And I know how much he enjoyed it. And as a result, music was, as I said, it was on in the house. He built Dynakit, sort of fancy stereo system, amplifier, receiver, etc., turntable back in those days. And there was always music going, and plus he would record his rehearsals and listen to them, and I always thought that was fun to listen to that repertoire. Music for Prague, 1968, of Karel Husa being played in 1970, when the ink was practically still wet. So at any rate, I think he had a curiosity about, he was not somebody who just played the same three pieces all year long for a competition and then repeated that cycle every 4 years. I mean, we covered a lot of repertoire. And again, I think he had a great enthusiasm for music, and that just spilled over into his students.
And so where did you end up going to school? Did you go to Texas?
I did. I went to the University of Texas in Austin, where I'm teaching now.
Yeah.
And I think there was some, I'm not exactly sure why I went there, really. I mean, it's only 2 hours from where I grew up, and we had some connections there. I had studied with the clarinet professor in the summer a little bit. And so I knew the situation, but once I was there, then I absolutely loved it. And I had some really wonderful teachers, great colleagues, great students who were there at the same time as I was. Carl St. Clair, who's a wonderful conductor, conductor of the Pacific Symphony Orchestra, I had known because we grew up 25 miles from each other, and Carl was a little older than I am, so he was like a senior in high school when I was a freshman. We played in the same all-region band together. Then I get to Texas, and he's a senior at Texas, and I'm a freshman. Then we sort of keep running into each other, it seems, for the rest of our careers also. But Tom Lee was the wind ensemble conductor at that time, who ended up leaving UT to go to UCLA. And so in a way, I followed him, my teacher, because there were interim situations for 3 years after Tom left. But I got my undergraduate degree there, played in Tom's wind ensemble. Clyde Roller, who was the second conductor of the Eastman Wind Ensemble after Dr. Fennell, he was the orchestra conductor at Texas during those years, and he was actually my beginning conducting teacher. So my first conducting teacher was Clyde Roller, and then Tom Lee after that. And so I got my undergraduate degree in 4 years. I wanted to be the world's greatest high school marching band director. And then an opportunity came up to stay at Texas, get a master's degree, study with Tom, have an assistantship in the band program, and also be the clarinet assistant. So I left at that, and by now I had an itch that really needed to be scratched in terms of the conducting bug. I really had it in a big way. So after that year, I had just graduated at age 22 or whatever it was with my master's. And so I was inches away from accepting a job in the Houston area to be a high school band director. And when I got back to Austin, just through a quirky set of circumstances, there was a job open on the faculty as the assistant marching band director. And it was late. This was in June. So it was too late to do a national search. And so they said, well, why don't we just get Junkin to do it for a year? Because he kind of did it last year as a graduate student. And I thought, well, I should do this because I'll never get a chance to teach at the collegiate level again. So I'll just do this for a year and then I'll be on my merry way. And, and then it did that 1 year turned into a second year, and that year turned into a third year. So I was at Texas for 3 years in that capacity before I just had to go get a doctorate. I really had the itch to study with Bob Reynolds at the University of Michigan. I had worked with him at a CBDNA conducting workshop and had met him and worked with him on a couple of other interesting occasions. And so I thought, okay, this is the person I want to study with. So I went to Ann Arbor to get a doctorate, which I actually never got because just a couple of weeks before school started, I was called to Bob's office. And he said, as you know, Carl St. Clair is moving from the band area into the orchestra area. And we thought we had his teaching load covered a different way, but that's not going to work out. So would you consider being on the faculty rather than going to school? So I thought, here's another, just being in the right place at the right time. I've got to say yes to this. When could that ever happen again? And so I did that, and one thing leads to another. I was there for 2 remarkable years and then left there to go to the University of South Florida as the director of bands when that job was open in 1984. Stayed there for 4 actually very happy years. I loved my colleagues there, had a great time there, learned a lot. And then the opportunity came up to go back to Austin 30 years ago. So that's the Reader's Digest version.
Yeah, that's remarkable. So I am somewhat new to the band world, or somewhat an outsider. I was a band director, and then I went and got a degree in composition and taught music theory in the college level. Right. Before I came back to write for band, and have sort of picked up my own conducting bug here in my 40s to get back to this. And so I don't really know the long history of music in Texas. Has that always been the tradition in Texas, the strong bands, the strong music?
Well, since probably the 1930s and 40s, yes. And who knows why it has happened. And I think you can say that it is probably, as much as some people hate to say this, but I think it is directly related to the rise of the success of high school football in Texas. And so in the beginning times, it revolved around the marching band, the high school marching band. And I think there was a sense of community pride, especially amongst us maybe in rural communities, smaller towns in Texas, that, well, at least our marching band was better than the other school's marching band, or, those sort of things. But for whatever reason, here we are now 80 years later. I think you can safely say that music education in Texas, and it's band, but it's also now very fine orchestra programs, very fine choral programs, that's viewed as being culturally important in this state, which not a lot of people realize, but it is. And I think there is still a great sense of community pride and interest and a desire to have young people be affiliated with music in this way. So I think it really is and there's a lot of reasons, a lot of people historically that have played a major role in that, but it is a very interesting cultural phenomenon that you feel when you walk into a school in Texas.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really amazing to watch. I wrote a piece of grade 4.5, and it has high A triplets in the trumpets, and it was played at TMEA by a middle school band.
Right.
And I thought, oh my goodness, I would never have expected that, because I was sort of naive to the level that the Texas middle school bands play at.
Oh, yes.
So, I mean, it's
extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. I suppose I should ask you that. What's the secret to that success?
Well, I think obviously excellent pedagogy, and I think there are a number of things. One is you cannot deny the fact that because music education and bands, maybe in particular, are viewed as being culturally important in Texas, then they are supported. They tend to be supported well by school districts and by fundraising parent organizations, things like that. So there is a luxury of personnel and staff and sometimes facilities and equipment that programs in Texas have at their disposal. And that's been developed over a long time. But nonetheless, I think that the teaching here is very, very strong. And I think there's a high degree of interest in the pedagogy of teaching wind and percussion instruments to young people. And, so I think that all goes to making technically very adept and skilled ensembles.
Yeah, I would agree. And there's also an expectation, so teachers can expect great things from the kids and they can deliver on that.
Absolutely.
So we should probably switch gears here and talk about your ensembles. I'd like to talk about the Dallas Winds.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that you work with lots of great composers. I know that you're doing the project right now with John Mackey, or is that the recording's done for that?
Yes, we finished that in August.
Okay.
Now, I haven't heard the first edit of the recording yet, but nonetheless, the actual recording has been finished, yes.
What's the value of that working with a composer, commissions, that sort of collaboration that comes with that?
Well, there's nothing like it. And in a way, why wouldn't you do that? I mean, if you were in the position to be able to do that, if William Shakespeare were somehow alive and we had the opportunity to ask him about the pacing of to be or not to be, I mean, we would want to have his insights into that. We want to try to hear from the source, because any notational system is imperfect. So you're wanting to find out the emotion behind it. What was it that caused these notes to actually appear on page? It wasn't a technical exercise. It wasn't, just manipulating this or that for the sake of compositional virtuosity. There was an emotion that came into play. And so that's what you want to hear. And if you have the opportunity to work with the composer and can receive insights from that person, well, then of course you would want to do that. So it's an experience really like nothing else. And as far as commissioning goes, I think, again, if you are in a position to do it, and many, many people are, and they don't even realize it, that it's one of the most important things that you can do to bring to life something that has never in the history of the world been heard or performed before. So it's really something that it's about as thrilling an experience as you can have as a conductor, I think.
Yeah, I hear this from most of my guests, and just recently talked to a conductor who talked about the idea of bringing an experience to his students.
Yes.
And so I guess the question I always want to know is how do we do this? How do you talk to a composer? How do you facilitate that commission? Do you have any advice for that?
First of all, it's like any kind of development. You have to develop a relationship. So, and this can be, we don't have to be talking about John Coriano or Christopher Rouse or Adam Schoenberg. We can be talking about someone in your community, someone who's very local, but develop a relationship with them. So it's not just a cold call, phone call out of the blue with no contact ever before, but just at least exchange of letters somehow, so that there begins to be a relationship, and then you develop that relationship. And eventually, and this is the mistake that I think I've seen people make before, is just never get around to asking. And so there's two ways to ask the question. Is one, what can you imagine any scenario by which you could write a piece for our band that we could perform? And sometimes the answer is, I'd love to do that. And sometimes the answer is, I just don't see myself doing it. And other times it's somewhere in between, which is, I would love to do that, but right now I just don't think I could do that in your time frame. But I could do it for the following year, or I could do it for the following semester. Could that work? And then that begins the discussion. And then it's always the awkward question, but at some point you have to ask the question of, so what would it take to do that? And sometimes if it's a really good friend, it's, just if you could just play it, and I would just love to be there for it if you could just get me there. And sometimes that would take $30,000. It can be anywhere in between. So if it's out of your budget, which your budget is maybe $800 for the project, well then you have friends. So you begin to make phone calls. You begin to send some emails. Hey, would there be any way that I'm willing to put up 1/5 of this? Could you? And then we would all be able to, we would form this consortium, and we would all be able to interact with the composer. So these things can happen. It just takes a little bit of work, but it's such an important thing. And every commission provides a new opportunity. So one, for those students to have some contact with a composer. Secondly, for them to get at what it was that the composer was thinking at the time they wrote this music. But also, it pushes along the repertoire. Sometimes these pieces, you get to the end of the day and you think, I'm not sure I like that too much. I don't know that I would do that again. Sometimes it is, man, that's a terrific piece, and it can be anywhere in between. But even the ones where you think, I wish it wouldn't have turned out that way, what that does is it still pushes the repertoire along. Because it's like trying to find a cure for cancer, I mean, there are all these experiments and all these clinical trials of drugs, and then 1 out of 1,000 makes some progress toward pushing you along. And that's really kind of what the process of commissioning a piece of music or any work of art is like.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I say that all the time. Bach wrote almost 1,000 pieces of music, and we don't listen to 1,000 of them.
Right.
I have to be careful about this question because it's like asking who your favorite child is, but do you have a notable experience, or do you have a moment with a composer that you remember as sort of really sticking out that you'd like to share as an anecdote?
Well, that's one that sticks out. There have been a number of them over the years.
Right. And I don't want to make it seem like you're choosing a favorite, because there's probably been many.
Yeah. Happily there have been. But I've been in some situations too where I've had a certain amount of discomfort, and that usually has become more about me and my failings. If a composer is going to be there, you want to do that composer's music at the highest possible level. So you don't want anything to be. I don't want anything to be my fault. Obviously, if I'm preparing my students, and I can remember working with one composer one time, and he kept saying that something's just off here. Something's off, and so we would go back through it, and I was quite convinced that we were doing exactly what was on the page. And the issue was I had not caught the fact that the glockenspiel part was being played an octave lower than notated. So of course it was sounding 2 octaves. Well, it was just in the wrong octave, So, and I hadn't, and that was ruining the color in the composer's mind of this whole section. Now it took him a few times to get it also, but that's something I should have caught, So when something like that happens, you can just kick yourself, and it makes you uncomfortable. But then you grow from that, because then, trust me, ever since then, I've not had that issue occur again. So, but then there have been some really happy moments too, and things when a composer would tell you that that's it. That's exactly what I was imagining. Those moments are really special, and that makes the students, the musicians who are in the ensemble, feel really wonderful too, because it feels like we're all a part of this team. This is a collaboration, and that now that circle is closed when you know from the composer that they're telling you, that's exactly the way I imagined it. And that's wonderful.
Yeah, it's a pretty special moment when that happens. And for me as a composer, it doesn't happen all that frequently, to be honest, because there's usually flaws. Not that the flaws really matter. Every performance to me of my music is exceptional because it's my music. But when there's that perfect performance, it's it sort of transcends everything.
I can remember that I don't want to, I shouldn't go down the rabbit hole here, naming specific things, but there was a moment when we were doing the first rehearsal for John Cogliano's Symphony Number 3, the Circus Maximus, in Austin. He was coming and going during those times, and we had sent him some recordings. And there were a couple of just minor tweaks that we had made based on a conversation that he and I had. And so I can remember playing through this, and it was in the prayer section of the piece. And we got to the end of it and turning it and it reflected this change that was made. And he was obviously moved by it and said, that's even better than I thought. So let's definitely leave that. So there are those moments, and every student in the group feels that they were a part of something special.
Well, I'll tell you that there's also a little bit of fear on the part of the composer sometimes, because, I respect the conductors who do my work. I respect the musicians who perform my work. And so I also want them to like it and want to make sure that I have a good relationship with them too. So
sure.
Do you think that, is there a way to overcome that fear? Maybe if someone who is thinking about commissioning someone or thinking of reaching out for a clinician or a conductor to come and visit their classroom, is there a way to overcome that? Do you have any thoughts on that maybe?
Well, I recently reread Pressman's book, The War of Art, and which is such a great book. I constantly recommend it to students and other people, but it's one of those books that as you're reading it, and especially the part that's dealing with procrastination, the sense is, I got it. This is true. Yeah, this is absolutely right. So why am I sitting here reading this book? I need to be working. So the same is true in a way of just reaching out. And you have to get past that first hurdle of your fear of being rejected.
Yeah.
So we have to all remember it's not about us somehow. So, and composers, I have found, like for their music to be performed. So,
I'll never say no.
Right. So I think there are appropriate questions to ask a composer about her or his music. There are also questions that are not composer questions. They're for someone else. How you figure a note on the piccolo or something like that. That's not a composer question. But I think just setting up that relationship and risking it and finding out that usually these people are very approachable and want their music to be performed and want it to be performed well at a high level. No one wants to do this for bad performances. So I think they are willing to be helpful in any way that they can. So I just haven't. There are some composers who I've dealt with who are prickly personalities, admittedly, but there are also some soloists and some colleagues and students in your ensemble who are prickly personalities, but you learn a way to interact with them. And I've never met like a mean-spirited composer. At least I've been fortunate in that regard. I've never worked with one who I thought was, well, this guy's just, this is terrible. I don't want to deal with this person anymore. Yeah. So I've never had that experience.
And, in the band world, I say this often as one of the things about the band world that to me is so attractive is it's so nice in general, as a whole. It's welcoming. It's warm. People want to make music. And I don't want to cast aspersions in a generalization, but sometimes the orchestral world can be a little colder, for sure. And
we had, I will tell you that we had a guest conductor for our University Symphony Orchestra. He was a great guy, but I won't mention any names here. But he was in Austin a year ago, and he was there at the time of our first concert with the wind ensemble. And so he was very kind. So he came to a dress rehearsal that we were having in the hall, and my colleague Gary Green, who's now retired from the University of Miami Frost School of Music, had come there just to hear the concert, just to be a guest, which was very nice of him to do. He had an interest in one of the pieces that was being done. So I turned around during the rehearsal and I introduced Gary to the wind ensemble. And many people had played under him in an honor band somewhere, or certainly knew of Gary Green. So at the end of it, I would go over to the orchestra conductor and I said, "Boy, thanks for coming. I didn't expect you to stay the whole time." I said, "No, it was great. I really enjoyed it." And then he said, "You band guys are weird." I said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" He goes, "That would never happen in an orchestra rehearsal." if another orchestra conductor was there, you wouldn't turn around and introduce them to the ensemble. And anyway, we proceeded to then have kind of a lengthy conversation about it. And I thought, well, for whatever reason, I sort of like the way then it seems to work in the band area, where people are mutually supportive. And also, quite frankly, when a new piece is performed, everyone is hungry for it and everyone shares the information about it. They'll send out recordings. We send out emails. Hey, be sure and take a look at this. Whereas there are other, and this is not talking about the orchestral area per se, because it sort of exists at a lot of different levels of art where there's this ownership of a piece where it's like, we don't want anybody else to know this is our piece, so nobody else should be playing this. So anyway, I think it's a very healthy relationship, especially in regard to things new in the band area.
Mm-hmm. It seems like in the orchestral world, the profits and the ability to kind of keep professional orchestras afloat makes the model of playing, what we call the war horses, the classics, the Beethovens, the Mozarts, such an important part of their business model. But my wife's a cellist, so I have to be a little careful here. And I know plenty of wonderfully warm and open orchestral people too. So I should.
Right.
One of my interviews prior to yours was Jerry Schwartz.
Oh, sure.
And I sat down with him at the Eastern Music Festival, one-on-one, and he's a wonderfully warm man and very gracious with his time. So.
And a remarkable musician. But one of my favorite recordings forever is a recording of, it was on the None Such label, of old cornet, theme and variations solo, with him playing and with William Bolcom.
Oh yeah.
Playing, it's unbelievable how good that recording is. It's such musicianship on both of their parts. It's very special.
Yeah, I'm going to actually link that in the show notes. And while I'm kind of talking about the show notes, I want to kind of clean up a couple things we mentioned.
Sure.
You talked about commissions, and there's a company called Composers in Schools in Concert that helps people set up consortiums.
Great.
And Lisa Oman runs that. So if anyone wants to look that up for help with consortiums, they do a lot of the paperwork. They send the contracts out and do that sort of thing. And the other thing you mentioned was The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield. I'll put that in the show notes as well.
Great.
All right. So we should probably get back to a new thing. I wanted to ask you about Asia and what that was like, how you got started in Hong Kong and then in Kawasaki. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a suburb of Tokyo. Yeah.
Okay. And how you got started with those and what that experience has been like for you?
Well, it's been a remarkable experience for me. I have loved every second of my time in Asia, and it's been really wonderful to spend time in another culture and learn about that culture and meet the people and interact with them. And now I've been there long enough in Hong Kong where I've known people and then watched them get married and then seen come back years later and they meet their kids and I've watched them grow up. So it's been a really wonderful thing in our lives. And my wife hasn't gone with me the last few years, but in the beginning years, she always did, and she adored Hong Kong. So that started with an email from Victor Tam, who founded the group, who's an oboist, freelance oboist. At the time, now he's much more than that in Hong Kong. But to tell you the truth, I ignored the first email because I thought it was spam, or I thought it was, a little bit of, because it was very brief, and it just said, "My name is Victor Tam, I'm from Hong Kong. I'm forming a professional group and would like to see if you would be interested in coming and conduct our initial concert." And that was about it. That may have even been longer than what I had actually read. And so I literally thought this thing that came from Yahoo mail address or something like that. I thought, okay, this is just some spam, or it's just a friend playing a prank. So I just ignored it. And then about a month later, I got another email with a little more, fleshed out a little bit more with a little more detail. And I think this is actually real. So I wrote it back, and I still don't know exactly how they got my name, except maybe it was because of just familiarity with the Dallas Winds. I don't know. But at any rate, so I went thinking that this would be a one-time thing, now 16 years ago, and Kenneth Che, saxophonist who teaches at the University of Iowa now, but he's a Hong Kong native, so he was going to be the guest soloist. And we discussed the program. At any rate, it was just great fun. It was just amazing. First of all, Hong Kong is a remarkable city. And So that's how the relationship got started with that first concert. And then it's, continued on with sometimes multiple trips there. We performed at the Wasby in Singapore in whenever that was. And we've done other tours, other run out concerts, Macau, some of the other areas around there. Played at both Chinwon Town Hall and the City Hall Music Hall in Hong Kong. But just really wonderful people. And I'm sure that the Hong Kong experience led to my being contacted by the Tokyo Kosei Wind Orchestra to do a concert with them. And so when I was doing that concert, it coincided, I think that was 2009 or 2010, something like that. The CBDNA conference had been held in Austin in 2009, and some of the members of the Kosei Wind Orchestra and some other people from Japan had come just to attend that. And that's when I was invited to come to Tokyo, and then the people from Shinzoku Gakuen had made contact. They came to that concert and invited me to come to the school. And then that started, I think, just the next year. So one thing leads to another in this life. You never know. You can't predict it. But I'm happy for all of it.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's give the listeners sort of like an insight into maybe what it would be like to be at Texas as a graduate student in conducting. And I'm going to ask you, do you have any sort of hard-earned advice or wisdom that you try to pass on to all of your students about conducting or about being a band director or being a musician?
Well,
and I'm sure there's more than one.
Yeah, there is. I mean, I think we're in a luxurious position that I have a lot of wonderful applicants each year from which to choose, graduate students. And there have been many fantastic, incredible people who have applied to come to grad school at UT that for one reason or another we just could not accept because of timing or the number of vacancies in a given year or whatever. So it's never about the fact that, those people were bad, were in any way, shape, or form. You wish you had more room, but there's a reality about the profession and how many positions there are and getting placements for people. And not that it's only a vocational training institution. I'm not suggesting that, but there is the reality of all of that to deal with. So we have a limited number of spaces. So in each year, maybe I'm accepting one or at the most two people into the program so that we have 4 people in residence at any given time, or maybe 5. So I think what I'm taking too long to say is that they can already conduct. That's not the issue. Everybody can conduct who's coming in. And the reason they're there is because there's something special. They have it, whatever it is, or at least believe that they have it, and can stimulate a group of musicians, and that they, on the other hand, can respond to the stimulus that's coming in their direction. So that's the sort of the technical mumbo jumbo about it, but also that, quite frankly, they just have to be a special person also. And you learn that in the interview, you learn that in the essay that they write, you learn that in a variety of different ways. So if I give any advice while they're there, it's to be a nice person and to get along with your colleagues, because you're going to keep running into the same people for the rest of your career. And I have met many wonderfully talented people whose careers went nowhere because they basically were not nice people, or just not really nice people, or they were just too difficult somehow. And that's just, the world doesn't need that. What the world needs are cooperative, sharing, giving, helpful musicians who can relate to each other, who are very high level music makers. So that's what you need. So that's the main thing, because we already know the musicianship is there. It's just a question of trying to save people some time and maybe helping to develop their musicianship even more if possible, but then also to encourage them to get along with people.
Yeah, that's wonderful advice. I was fortunate enough to get my doctorate at Florida State, and I took conducting with Jim Croft, and he was one of the nicest, kindest people I ever met.
Absolutely.
Just unbelievable.
Nice man. Yeah.
And I also took a college teaching course with Cliff Mattson, and he said the same thing to me. He said, it's about relationships. It's about, how you get along with others more than anything.
Right. Absolutely.
So conducting is interesting to me because I was a high school band director, and I was just talking with my colleague who studied with you about this, is that I had a semester of conducting or 2 semesters of conducting as an undergraduate, a semester as a master's student, and then a semester as a doctoral student. And I also was a high school band director for 4 years. So I don't consider my baton to be particularly strong, but I feel like I'm a good conductor. Is there something, what advice would you give someone like me, or maybe a high school band director who wanted to make their stick better, to make that, what can they do?
Well, there are some very practical things, and one of them is you can go back to school. And I don't mean go back to school to get a master's degree or a doctorate.
Sure.
But there are now countless conducting workshops that take place in this country, which used to be, 30 years ago, those weren't kind of unheard of, or maybe there was one a year. Now, every summer, there are at least a dozen conducting workshops that all go fully subscribed. I haven't heard of one lacking enrollment in years. They're fully subscribed, and maybe they're 5 days, 4 days, 6 days, whatever, intensive work. And it's a way to recharge your battery, because it not only deals with your conducting technique, but it deals with your musicianship and your standards and your just artistic spirit. So I highly recommend those, and I especially highly recommend them to, if you're someone who's considering getting a master's or a doctorate in conducting, and you want to go to the University of Texas, the University of North Texas, Michigan, Michigan State, Northwestern, Ithaca. Anyway, I shouldn't even start naming schools, but all these places have summer conducting workshops, and they're all good. So just go to one of those. If you want to study with Eugene Corporon at North Texas, go to their summer conducting symposium. And 2 things will happen. One of which, it will convince you that absolutely I've got to figure out some way to be here over the long haul. Or the other thing that will happen is, I'm not feeling it. Maybe I need to go somewhere else and look. Maybe there would be a better match somewhere else. So, and that's a perfectly natural reaction. It happens all the time, no matter which conducting workshop you go to. So that's one way. But there are also, during the course of the year, there are 1-day workshops, 2-day workshops over a weekend. So if one of those opportunities were to present itself to someone who doesn't really have any long-term aspiration to get a graduate degree, they just want to improve themselves, go to one of those. Also, reach out to someone in your area who's a fine conductor and just talk about it. There's a great quote in the Little Red Book of Harvey Penick, the golf book, but he says, if you want to be a better putter, go to lunch with good putters. So if there's someone in your area who's a fine conductor, just buy them a cup of coffee and sit and talk with them and find out a little bit about what makes them tick. What things are they interested in? What kind of a person are they? And then you can also learn maybe something about conducting if the subject ever bothers to get around to that.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. That's great advice. And that's kind of where I was hoping you would take this. Really quickly, can I ask you your thoughts about choosing music? What are you looking for in a piece of music when you select it?
Well, this is not original with me, but it is true that when you're selecting a music to perform on a concert, you're doing one of 2 things. One is you're selecting that piece of music, but you are also rejecting every other piece that has ever been composed in the history of the world in order to do that piece. So there better be a darn good reason for doing that piece. There should be some compelling reason to why this piece and not anything else. And perhaps it is some sort of a musical connection within a program. It can be all sorts of things. It can be a particular composer whose works you're studying right at that moment. It can be because it happened to be composed in a certain year, and that fits with all of the rest of your programming scheme. But I think there has to be a better reason than just, that piece sounds good, or a better reason than, my students like it. They just like it. So I don't know. And I don't think it's a very good piece. Well, my kids like it. Well, that's a terrible reason to do anything. Fortunately, the English literature teachers don't make their literature choices based on that. So, students are 14, 15, 16 years old in high school. They don't know enough. They can respond to or whatever the sort of visceral reaction of something is for the most part. So it's our job as a teacher to provide them with a great diet of high level music that provides some sort of artistic outlet. And I think, there has to be a compelling reason for doing a piece of music other than just, well, it's new, or the publisher sent it to me, or, well, we did a piece by this same composer a couple of years ago and my students really liked it, so I'm going to try this one too. So there has to be something that goes beyond all of that.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any advice to the high school band director, the middle school band director who is confronted with the choices every summer? 2,000 pieces come out or however many. How do you sift through that? Where do you begin?
It's daunting.
It is daunting.
And it happens, I'm in a situation where a lot of music comes to me to look at. And I think that some composers can get frustrated with you, but I can only do that at a certain time of year because I just, if I'm getting, I don't know what the average is, one score a week from a composer or something like that, I don't have time every week to be looking at one or two pieces for evaluating for the next year or two down the road because I'm in the process of, I've got to, like just like a public school teacher, you got a lot of preparations to make. I teach a conducting class. I teach graduate students, but I conduct the UT Wind Ensemble, the Dallas Winds, these other groups. So I've got a lot of music. I've got some musical plates spinning also. So what I always tell people is that thanks for sending, but I'm going to put it aside and I will look at it during the summer as you speak. So I think that is the time to do it so that you can do it over a 1 week period or over a 2 week period, because I think when you're looking at one piece after another, it does give you some perspective that sometimes they fall into, and especially when we're dealing with music that is published, that is written for what we might term to be an educational market. There can be sometimes a similarity in those works. And so those pieces that are out of the mainstream, or at least break that stream of sort of simultaneous thinking that it seems like sometimes publishing companies might have, but all of a sudden, this one seems special. There's something about this. It's intriguing, and I can't even tell you what it is right now, but I'm just going to put this one to the side here. I'm going to look at this one again. So it's easier to find those gems, I think, when you're doing them all together rather than just picking them up and thinking, well, okay, I don't know about this one, and then one comes up 3 weeks later. It's more difficult to make those kinds of judgments. But some composers, some publishing companies will send you sound files. Talk to friends. This is the other thing. If you have some colleagues, just talk to them about repertoire, things that have worked well for them in the past, things that they've found their students really reacted to, but there was some unique flavor to it. Just talk to people. So it's difficult to live in a vacuum here, and especially in a more rural setting, and you go to a convention or you get to go into a larger city and go to a music store and file through scores, just doing that totally on your own. I mean, most of the repertoire that comes to me, I'm either aware of or someone has recommended it to me, or I've heard it, or there's a buzz about it. So I think in a way I'm doing the same thing. I'm like a moth attracted to some sort of a bright light that if I'm hearing some positive feedback, well, I'm certainly inclined to go to that piece and look at it.
I think it's interesting. I was drawing connections as you were talking about the pieces in the educational marketplace to the conversation we had earlier about how some things jump out. Not every piece is a masterpiece and kind of thing.
Right. And, that's a difficult thing when you're a conductor. I think it's a difficult thing when you're a composer. Obviously, you write a piece and you hope that it has wide appeal.
Sure.
You want people to like your music. But sometimes, for whatever reason, it just doesn't resonate.
Yeah.
So that's the nature of the piece. Some clarinetists play the Bernstein Sonata, and some people tell you it's a piece of trash. So it just, whatever... everyone has different tastes, so you have to respect that.
Absolutely. So we're coming up here towards the end. So I want to get to my sort of final battery of questions that I ask everyone. And so I'm going to ask you, and this is a big question. You can answer it as widely or as narrowly as you'd like. And maybe you already did earlier, but what do you think are the biggest challenges facing us as music educators or the band world or the music world as a whole as we move forward into the 21st century?
Well, I think there are obviously some big challenges, but the great people will rise and will realize that the world needs music, the world needs art, and I think there's always going to be that need, and people are always going to feel that need, and they'll feel nourished by it. So it's never going to go away. I'm not at all worried about that. I do think that in terms of public education, it's something that we have to remain vigilant about, that we continue to keep arts at the forefront of people's thinking, and that people do recognize the arts as being important. And obviously the teachers do, but there it becomes, we'll all have to do a number of things in our careers. I think every year that goes on, we have to be entrepreneurs. In addition to being music educators, we have to be philosophers in a way. We have to be politicians. I mean, there's a lot of hats that we have to wear in order to keep music available to students. I think those, and this will be interesting to watch in Texas actually over time, but those programs that are so closely associated with athletics, meaning marching band activity, community support for those things, over the course of the next 20 to 30 years, that's going to be, you're going to have to justify, I think, your program in a separate way than dealing with athletics. Because who knows, football may not exist as we know it in 30 years. I mean, with all of the research that's coming to light about head injuries and all of that stuff, that even, and now it could be that when this day comes at the University of Texas and places like USC and Alabama and Michigan and places like that will be among the last holdouts, who knows? But nonetheless, I think there is a possibility over time that athletic bands, at least football athletic bands, are going to not be what we know them to be now. So you have to develop a way to reach students that goes beyond that experience. And we can't just throw up our hands and say, well, that'll be the end of my funding and that'll be the end of my program. No, absolutely not. All it does is provides new opportunities. So we have to be aware of those opportunities as teachers.
Sure. Yeah, that's a really interesting take on that. I hadn't thought about that. But you're right about football, and there are warning signs that it may go away.
Sure.
Okay, so what advice would you give your young self, your 20-year-old self?
This is, well, I broke every rule in the book for what I tell my students now. So now I always recommend to people when they graduate with their undergraduate degree that they go, if they're getting a degree in music education, that they go teach somewhere, so that they learn what it is that they still need to learn. Because going into a master's degree program, that's supposed to give you information that you don't have, or give you things to think about that you have not yet contemplated. So until you teach in the public schools, if you're going to be a band conductor, you don't have that thought necessarily of, how exactly do you put your hand in a hornbill? I thought I knew that. So those sorts of things, I think, when someone has taught, then you know what it is you need to still do. I just went ahead and got a master's degree, so I'm the last one to say anything about that. So I think I would tell myself, you can't look back, and I think it all turned out well. So I'm not saying I would have done anything differently, except I should have paid more attention as an undergrad. I should have gone to a little bit more class, and I should have, some of the typical undergrad mistakes that people made, I made some of those. And I suppose it all goes into making you who you are, but I wish I would have gone to a few more ear training classes when I was a sophomore, because then I wouldn't have had to do so much work on my own later. Just little silly things like that. Don't be in such a hurry and think that I know what I need.
All right, so this is a question that some people don't like to answer, but what's your favorite work for wind ensemble? And if you don't want me to ask it that way, I asked Pat Vandehei what would be the last piece he'd want to conduct before he put his baton down for good.
Well, Okay, I see what you're saying. Rather than what is the last piece you'd ever want to conduct? In the negative, you're turning that as a positive.
Well, what's your favorite? Well, I guess some people see it. They don't want to pick a favorite, but
Right.
We all have something that we, if you could only do it one more time, you know what I mean?
Sure, of course, yeah. I mean, because the problem is narrowing it down to one.
Sure.
There are a lot of great pieces, and by the time that day comes for me to hang up the baton, who knows what will exist at that particular time. But I suppose the first thought that comes to my mind is the Mozart Serenade Number 10 in B flat, the Grand Partita, K361, which that piece will be performed as long as there is music that is performed. So it's such an extraordinary work of art. And there are so many other wonderful pieces, but I suppose to answer the question, if someone really tied my hands behind my back and had a knife to my throat or whatever it was, that's the one I would have to say.
Okay. Is there anything coming up that you'd like to share or promote?
Well, let's see. I'll be here in Dallas as we're talking about this. We're making this interview mid-September of 2017. So I have a concert on Tuesday night here to start the season with the Dallas Winds. So we have that coming up on Tuesday. That's always an exciting time to have the season opening concert. We're doing a terrific piece. I mean, this is not the only piece on the program, but we're doing Michael Dougherty's tuba concerto, The Reflections on the Mississippi, with Charles Villarubia as the soloist. That would be terrific. But on the second half, we're doing Michael Martin's First Symphony, which is titled Blantano, which he wrote for Mallory Thompson and the Northwestern Symphonic Wind Ensemble a year or two ago, and which I think is a really wonderful piece. And Mike will be here for this afternoon's rehearsal, so that'll be yet another one of those experiences with a composer that I'm very much looking forward to. But and then there's season opening concert in Austin in a week and a half after that, in which we'll play the Maslenka Symphony Number 4. We changed the program once David passed away in early August, so that we could do that piece, because that will be 27. Yeah, wow, is that really true? Almost 23 years, because it was first done in 1994 after the premiere performance that we gave in the same hall, Bates Recital Hall at UT Austin. So we thought that would be a nice thing to include in David's memory. But it's just there are a lot of interesting concerts, I think, over the course of the season. But it's just it's all. I just couldn't do anything else. I'm not smart enough to do anything, so I'm so lucky to be able to do this and go from one interesting project to another. I don't take it for granted.
Yeah. So how can people get in touch with you?
It's fairly easy. I mean, but if you go to the Dallas Winds website or to the University of Texas website, they both collide, so they gives you the same contact information. But email is best, which I'll just tell you is JF Junkin, no S. A lot of people like us there, but it's just JF Junkin at austin.utexas.edu. So email is the best way. But phone, that comes up in the directories of, I think, both of those schools. So it's pretty easy.
Jerry, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to talk with you.